Her name was Lyudmila Pavlichenko, and she would soon develop a technique so psychologically devastating, so radically different from conventional warfare, that it would change the nature of sniper combat forever, and earn her a reputation as one of the most feared soldiers on the Eastern Front. But before we dive into the incredible story of how this young woman developed what would later be called the patience game, a revolutionary method that allowed her to achieve 309 confirmed eliminations in just 11 months of combat, I want to ask you something. If you're fascinated by real stories of courage, strategy, and survival from the Second World War, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. It truly helps us bring you more incredible true stories from history. And don't forget to leave a comment telling us what aspect of World War II history interests you most. Now, let's get back to Lyudmila's extraordinary journey. Lyudmila Mikhailovna Belova was born on July 12, 1916, in Bila Tserkva, a city south of Kiev in what was then the Russian Empire. From her earliest years, she was what people called a tomboy, fiercely competitive, and determined to prove that girls could excel at anything boys could do, and often do it better. This competitive spirit would define her entire life, driving her to accomplish things that most people, regardless of gender, could never imagine. When Lyudmila was 14, her family relocated to Kiev. Her father, Mikhail Belov, was a locksmith and a Communist Party member who had served as a regimental commissar in the Red Army, earning the Order of the Red Banner for his service. Her mother, Elena Trofimovna Belova, came from Russian nobility. This combination of working-class determination and refined discipline would shape Lyudmila's character profoundly. In Kiev, something happened that would change the trajectory of Lyudmila's life forever. A neighborhood boy bragged about his shooting skills, and in typical fashion, Lyudmila took it as a challenge. She enrolled in an Oso Vyachim shooting club, a civilian organization that provided basic military training to Soviet citizens. What started as a competitive gesture quickly became a passion. Lyudmila discovered she had an extraordinary natural talent for marksmanship, but talent alone wasn't enough for Lyudmila. She practiced obsessively, spending hours at the range developing not just accuracy, but something else, something that shooting instructors found unusual and even slightly unsettling. She could enter what she later described as a dissociative state, where emotion completely vanished and only pure calculation remained. Her heartbeat would slow, her hands would become perfectly steady. It was as if she could switch off the part of her brain that felt fear, excitement, or doubt, leaving only cold precision. By the time she was in her late teens, Lyudmila had earned her Voroshilov Sharpshooter Badge, a prestigious civil decoration, along with a marksman certificate. She had become an amateur sharpshooter of remarkable skill. But shooting at targets on a range was just the beginning of her education. In 1932, at age 16, Lyudmila married Alexei Pavlichenko and gave birth to a son, Rostislav. However, the marriage dissolved quickly, and Lyudmila returned to live with her parents. As a single mother, she took on multiple responsibilities. She worked during the day as a grinder at the Kiev Arsenal factory, a grueling job that required precision and endurance. At night, she attended school, determined to continue her education despite the challenges. In 1937, Lyudmila enrolled at Kiev University, where she studied history with the intention of becoming a scholar and teacher. She was living the life of a typical Soviet student, competing on the university's track team as a sprinter and pole vaulter, attending lectures and planning for a peaceful academic future. But she never abandoned her passion for marksmanship. She enrolled in a military-style sniping school for 6 months, training that was provided by the Red Army to civilians who showed promise. During this training, Lyudmila began developing what would become her signature methodology. While other trainees focused primarily on accuracy and speed, Lyudmila became obsessed with patience. She would practice lying motionless in uncomfortable positions for hours, training her body to ignore pain, cold, heat, and the desperate urge to move. She learned to slow her breathing to barely perceptible levels, to lower her pulse rate, and to maintain absolute focus even when instructors deliberately tried to distract her with simulated artillery fire or verbal provocations. Her instructors found her methods strange. Most snipers of that era were taught to take multiple shots from a good position, prioritizing volume over perfection. Lyudmila's approach was the opposite. She would identify a target and then wait, sometimes for an entire day, studying its movements, its patterns, its moments of vulnerability. Only when she was absolutely certain of a single perfect shot would she fire. Her training officers thought this was wildly inefficient. They had no idea that this young woman was developing a tactical philosophy that would revolutionize Soviet sniper doctrine. For 4 years, Lyudmila lived this dual existence, student by day, aspiring marksman in her spare time, mother whenever she could be. She was in her 4th year at Kiev University when everything changed. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. Over 3 million Axis troops poured across the Soviet border, supported by thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces. The invasion was swift, brutal, and catastrophic. Lyudmila was 25 years old when she heard the news. While many of her fellow students panicked or made plans to evacuate, Lyudmila made a different choice. She went directly to the Odessa recruiting office and volunteered for the infantry, not as a nurse, not as a support worker, but as a combat soldier. The registrar at the recruiting office tried to push her toward nursing. This was standard practice. The Soviet military, despite its propaganda about gender equality, was still deeply skeptical about women in direct combat roles. But Lyudmila refused. She insisted she wanted to fight. The registrar, probably thinking she was just another naive volunteer with romantic notions about war, tried to dismiss her. That's when Lyudmila mentioned her extensive training, her marksman certificate, and her years of sniper school. Even then, the military bureaucracy was reluctant. They needed proof. So they gave her a test that they probably assumed she would fail. They sent her to a Soviet-defended hill near Odessa where Romanian collaborators, allied with the Germans, had established forward positions. They handed her a Mosin-Nagant rifle and basically told her to prove herself. If she could eliminate 2 enemy soldiers, they would consider her application. Lyudmila climbed to a concealed position on that hill, and for the first time in her life, she aimed at human beings rather than paper targets. Through her scope, she could see 2 Romanian officers moving between positions, probably coordinating their forces or conducting reconnaissance. They had no idea they were being watched. At a distance of approximately 400 meters, Lyudmila steadied her breathing, entered that strange, dissociative state she had trained herself to achieve, and fired twice. Both officers went down. Both shots were fatal. It had taken her less than 30 seconds to prove what years of training had prepared her for. She was immediately enrolled into the Red Army's 25th Rifle Division as a sniper. She had become one of approximately 2,000 female snipers who would serve in the Red Army during the war, though only about 500 of them would survive to see its end. But Lyudmila's entry into actual combat was not immediate or glamorous. Initially, she was assigned to dig trenches and communication routes. The Soviet military was experiencing severe weapon shortages, and for her first several weeks as a soldier, she was armed with nothing but a single RGD-33 grenade. She spent days in the dirt, digging, while German and Romanian forces pressed closer to Odessa. Then, in the second half of July 1941, everything changed. A comrade near Lyudmila was severely wounded by shrapnel from an artillery blast. As the soldier lay bleeding, he handed Lyudmila his Mosin Nagant Model 1891 bolt-action rifle. It was a weapon that had been in service since before the turn of the century, but in the hands of a skilled marksman, it was devastatingly effective. Lyudmila finally had the tool she needed. On August 8, 1941, in the village of Bilyayevka near Odessa, Lyudmila experienced her true debut as a wartime sniper. This wasn't a demonstration for skeptical recruiters. This was real combat, with her life and the lives of her comrades hanging in the balance. Two enemy officers were coordinating an advance, confident in their superior numbers and firepower. They made the fatal mistake of assuming they were beyond the range of effective Soviet resistance. Lyudmila, concealed in rubble about 400 meters away, proved them catastrophically wrong. 2 shots, 2 eliminations. Her combat record had officially begun. Now here's where Lyudmila's revolutionary technique truly came into play. The average lifespan of a Soviet sniper on the front lines was approximately 3 weeks. Think about that for a moment. 3 weeks. The role was so dangerous, so exposed, that most snipers didn't survive even a month. The Germans and their allies had developed extensive counter-sniper tactics. They had spotters trained to watch for muzzle flash, artillery teams ready to bombard any suspected sniper position, and their own elite marksmen specifically tasked with hunting Soviet snipers. In this environment, Lyudmila realized that conventional sniper tactics would get her ended within days. So she implemented the patience game, the methodology she had been developing for years. And it was far more sophisticated than simply waiting a long time before shooting. First, Lyudmila never took the obvious position. German counter-snipers were trained to expect Soviet marksmen to set up in bell towers, on rooftops, in church steeples, anywhere that offered maximum elevation and visibility. So Lyudmila did the opposite. She went low. She concealed herself in rubble piles, inside destroyed buildings at ground level, behind remains of the fallen, in bombed-out basements, anywhere that violated standard tactical doctrine, places where no one would think to look for a sniper. Second, she moved constantly but slowly. After each shot, she would remain absolutely motionless for at least 30 minutes, not because she was resting, but because German spotters were watching for any movement. They calculated sniper positions based on muzzle flash and sound, so Lyudmila would wait until she was certain no one was observing, and then she would crawl, not walk, crawl, to a new position 5 to 10 meters away. By the time German artillery zeroed in on her previous location and unleashed their bombardment, she was already gone. Third, she employed radical patience in target selection. Most snipers of that era would engage the first available target, reasoning that any casualty was a good casualty. Lyudmila rejected this approach entirely. She would identify high-value targets, officers, communication specialists, artillery spotters, and then she would wait. She would study their routines, noting when they emerged from cover, when they checked supply lines, when they lit cigarettes, when they thought they were safe. Sometimes she would observe a target for 3 entire days before firing. And when she did fire, it was always at the exact moment when the target's guard was completely down. Fourth, and perhaps most psychologically devastating, she played what could only be called mind games with the enemy. German snipers would try various tricks to get Soviet marksmen to reveal their positions. They would toss tin cans that glinted in the sunlight, hoping a sniper would take a shot and give away their location. They would place dummies dressed in German uniforms in bushes. One German soldier even brought a cat and threw it into the open, apparently hoping that the appearance of something harmless would make Lyudmila believe the area was unobserved. Lyudmila never fell for these tricks. She would watch enemy snipers exhaust their entire repertoire of deceptions. Hours would pass. The German marksman would eventually assume the coast was clear and stand up or shift position. That was the instant Lyudmila would fire. 1 shot, 1 elimination, maximum psychological impact. The psychological dimension of her work cannot be overstated. Imagine being a German soldier on the Eastern Front. You're already dealing with brutal combat, harsh weather, and supply shortages. And then soldiers around you start falling, eliminated by shots that seem to come from nowhere. No muzzle flash, no follow-up shots, just sudden casualty followed by silence. You never see the sniper. You never even know where to return fire. All you know is that somewhere out there, someone is watching, waiting with infinite patience for you to make a single mistake. This psychological warfare was incredibly effective. German units operating in areas where Lyudmila was known to be active became increasingly cautious, moving more slowly, advancing more hesitantly. The mere possibility of her presence disrupted their operations. Some German commanders became so obsessed with counter-sniping her that they diverted significant resources away from their primary objectives. During the siege of Odessa, which lasted approximately 2.5 months, Lyudmila was credited with eliminating 187 enemy soldiers. This was an astounding number, especially considering the average survival rate for snipers. In August 1941, when her count surpassed 100, she was promoted to senior sergeant. She had also married again during this period to a fellow sniper named Alexei Kitsenko. But tragedy struck quickly. Shortly after their marriage, Kitsenko was mortally wounded by a mortar shell and passed away from his injuries within days. The personal loss could have broken her, but Lyudmila channeled her grief into cold determination. She continued her work with even greater focus. Her ability to enter that dissociative state, to separate emotion from action, became even more pronounced. Fellow soldiers reported that she seemed almost mechanical in her precision, though they meant it as a compliment. In the chaos and terror of the siege, Lyudmila represented something steady, something reliable, something the enemy should fear. On October 15, 1941, Odessa fell to the Germans and their Romanian allies. The city could no longer be defended. Lyudmila and her unit were evacuated by sea to Sevastopol, on the Crimean Peninsula, where an even more brutal siege was about to unfold. The siege of Sevastopol would last 8 months and become one of the bloodiest engagements of the entire war. The fighting was intense, relentless, and resulted in immense Soviet casualties. It was also where Lyudmila's reputation truly became legendary. The Germans began to learn her name. They started to understand that this wasn't just an unusually skilled sniper, this was something unprecedented. By May 1942, Lyudmila's confirmed count had risen to 257. She was promoted to lieutenant, a remarkable achievement for someone who had been a university student just 1 year earlier. But with this recognition came increasingly dangerous mission assignments. The Soviet High Command now saw her as an asset to be deployed against the most difficult targets. Specifically, she was assigned to counter-sniping, the practice of engaging in duels with enemy snipers. Counter-sniper duels were among the most dangerous forms of combat in the entire war. Both participants are highly trained, both are concealed, both are patient, and both understand that a single mistake means elimination. These duels could last hours or even days, with both snipers trying to trick the other into revealing their position. Lyudmila fought numerous counter-sniper duels during the siege of Sevastopol. She won every single one. One particular duel lasted 3 full days. For 72 hours, Lyudmila and a German sniper played a deadly game of cat and mouse. Both set traps for the other. Both used decoys, false positions, and psychological tactics. The German sniper was clearly experienced, probably a veteran who had survived dozens of engagements, but Lyudmila's patience game was unmatched. She waited. She observed. She studied every tiny movement, every pattern. And on the third day, as Pavlichenko herself later recounted, the enemy made one move too many. One tiny error, one moment of reduced vigilance, and Lyudmila fired. The duel was over. In total, Lyudmila eliminated 36 enemy snipers during her service, each one a trained professional, each one a soldier who had survived long enough to earn their position. The fact that she won every single duel speaks to the effectiveness of her methodology. Her technique of lying motionless for extended periods became the stuff of legend among Soviet forces. Fellow soldiers reported that Lyudmila could remain in position for up to 18 hours without moving, barely breathing, eating only bread and drinking small amounts of water when absolutely necessary. Her ability to endure physical discomfort was extraordinary. While most people would find lying motionless in the same position for even 1 hour unbearable, Lyudmila could do it for an entire day, her eyes constantly scanning, her mind constantly calculating, waiting for that one perfect moment. But even the most skilled soldier is not invulnerable. In June 1942, during the savage fighting in Sevastopol, Lyudmila's extraordinary run came to a sudden halt. A German mortar team targeted her general area, and shrapnel from one of the explosions struck her in the face. The wound was serious, and for the first time in 11 months of continuous combat, Lyudmila Pavlichenko was no longer able to fight. The Soviet High Command made an immediate decision. Lyudmila was too valuable to risk losing. Before she had even fully recovered from her injury, orders came down to evacuate her from Sevastopol via submarine. This was an extraordinary measure. Submarines were used to evacuate high-ranking officials and critical intelligence assets, not individual soldiers. But Lyudmila had become something more than just a soldier. She had become a symbol. When she was pulled from the front lines, Lyudmila's official record stood at 309 confirmed enemy eliminations, achieved in approximately 11 months of combat. To put this in perspective, most snipers of that era who survived for any length of time would accumulate perhaps 30 to 50 confirmed counts during the entire war. Lyudmila had achieved more than 6 times that number in less than a year. Her record made her the most successful female sniper in history and one of the most effective snipers, regardless of gender. The Germans, of course, knew exactly who she was. They had been trying to stop her for months. At various points during her service, German loudspeakers would broadcast messages specifically directed at Lyudmila, trying to convince her to defect. One message stated, "Lyudmila Pavlichenko, come over to us. We will give you plenty of chocolate and make you a German officer." She ignored these attempts entirely. As the siege continued and her count rose, the German messages changed from bribes to threats. One particularly chilling broadcast stated, "If we catch you, we will tear you into 309 pieces and scatter them to the winds." Years later, Lyudmila remarked that she was actually pleased to hear this threat because it meant the enemy had an accurate count of her record. But instead of returning to combat after her recovery, Lyudmila was given a completely different assignment. The Soviet Union needed her for something other than fighting. They needed her for propaganda. By late 1942, the Eastern Front was catastrophic for the Soviet Union. Despite fierce resistance, German forces were pushing deeper into Soviet territory. Soviet casualties were astronomical. Joseph Stalin desperately needed the Western Allies, specifically the United States and Great Britain, to open a second front in Europe to divide German forces. But the Americans and British were hesitant, still building up their forces, still planning. So the Soviet government decided to send Lyudmila on a publicity tour to rally support for a second front. In late 1942, at age 25, wounded 4 times in combat, speaking no English, Lyudmila Pavlichenko arrived in Washington, D.C. She became the first Soviet citizen to be officially received at the White House, welcomed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself. At the White House, she met First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, and the two women formed an immediate and deep friendship that would last for the rest of their lives. Eleanor Roosevelt asked Lyudmila to join her on a tour of the United States so that Lyudmila could speak directly to the American people about her experiences. What followed was a surreal and often frustrating experience for a combat veteran who had spent the last year in the most brutal fighting imaginable. The American press absolutely did not know what to make of Lyudmila. Newspapers called her the Girl Sniper, a diminutive title that revealed the era's deep sexism. Rather than asking about her military tactics or her experiences in combat, reporters asked about fashion. One reporter criticized the length of her uniform skirt, saying that in America women wore shorter skirts and, besides, her uniform made her look fat. Another asked if she was allowed to wear makeup on the front lines. Lyudmila responded with barely concealed contempt. Who has time to worry about their shiny nose when there's a battle going on? The questions became increasingly absurd. Reporters wanted to know about her personal life, her appearance, her clothes, everything except the actual substance of her military service. At one point, she challenged an especially offensive reporter to a fist fight. When asked about her undergarments, she responded coldly, "I am proud to wear the uniform of the legendary Red Army. It has been sanctified by the blood of my comrades who have fallen in combat with the fascists." Reporters described her as very blunt and unemotional, apparently surprised that someone who had spent 11 months engaged in some of the most intense combat in human history was not particularly interested in discussing fashion and makeup. But despite the frustrating triviality of the press, Lyudmila pushed forward with her mission. She began to find her voice as a public speaker. She appeared before the International Student Assembly in Washington, attended meetings of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and made speeches in New York City and Chicago. In New York, Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia presented her with a raccoon fur coat. The United States government gave her a Colt semi-automatic pistol as a gift. But it was in Chicago where Lyudmila delivered what would become her most famous speech. Standing before a large crowd, she looked out at the audience of primarily men and stated, "Gentlemen, I am 25 years old, and I have eliminated 309 fascist invaders by now. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" The crowd erupted. The applause was thunderous. This was the message the Soviet government had sent her to deliver, a call for action, a challenge to American masculinity, a demand that the Western Allies stop waiting and start fighting. It was brutally effective. Lyudmila's tour extended beyond the United States. She traveled to Canada, where she was presented with a Winchester Model 70 rifle equipped with a Weaver telescopic sight. Thousands of people greeted her at Toronto's Union Station. She also visited Great Britain, where she toured bomb-damaged cities like Coventry. In Coventry, she accepted donations of £4,516 from local workers to pay for 3 X-ray units for the Red Army. She visited destroyed factories and cathedral ruins, seeing the British civilian experience of the war. Throughout her tour, Lyudmila spoke about things that made American and British audiences uncomfortable. She talked about the lack of racial segregation in the Red Army, a pointed criticism of American military policy. She spoke about gender equality in Soviet society, challenging Western assumptions. For a nation that prided itself on democracy and freedom, being lectured by a Soviet soldier about equality was awkward, but Lyudmila didn't care about diplomatic niceties. She had survived nearly a year of combat. She had watched comrades perish. She had seen entire cities destroyed. She spoke with the authority of someone who had lived through horrors that most of her audiences couldn't begin to imagine. Despite her tour, despite her speeches, despite the publicity and the pressure, the Western Allies did not immediately open a second front. Stalin and the Soviet people would have to wait until June 1944, nearly 2 years after Lyudmila's tour, before Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy, finally began. By that time, the Soviet Union had suffered tens of millions of casualties. When Lyudmila returned to the Soviet Union, she was promoted to major and awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the country's highest military distinction. She also received the Order of Lenin twice, the nation's highest civilian honor. These were extraordinary recognitions, making her one of the most decorated soldiers in Soviet history. But Lyudmila never returned to combat. The Soviet High Command had decided she was too valuable as a trainer and as a symbol. For the remainder of the war, she trained other Soviet snipers, passing on her techniques and methodology. The patience game, as her approach came to be known, was codified into official Soviet sniper doctrine. Field manuals printed in 1944 specifically incorporated her tactics. That willingness to wait days for a single perfect shot, that emphasis on psychological warfare over volume of fire, that philosophy of making each shot count. Post-war analysis showed that snipers trained in Pavlichenko's techniques had 34% higher survival rates than those using traditional methods. Think about what that means. Her revolutionary approach didn't just make snipers more effective at eliminating enemy soldiers, it dramatically increased their chances of surviving the war. In a role where the average lifespan was 3 weeks, a 34% increase in survival rate was the difference between life and inevitable casualty. After the war ended in 1945, Lyudmila returned to her original dream. She completed her studies at Kiev University and became a historian, the profession she had been preparing for when the war interrupted her life. From 1945 to 1953, she worked as a research assistant at Soviet Navy headquarters. She became active in the Soviet Committee of Veterans of War, helping other soldiers transition to civilian life and preserving the memory of those who had fallen. In 1957, 15 years after her tour of the United States, Eleanor Roosevelt visited Moscow. The former First Lady was adamant that she would not leave the Soviet Union without seeing her old friend Lyudmila. This was during the height of the Cold War, when tensions between the United States and Soviet Union were at their peak. Permission was eventually granted, and Mrs. Roosevelt was brought to the small apartment in Moscow where Lyudmila was living. The visit was supervised. Both women were accompanied by government handlers and observers, but at one point they managed to slip past their attendants. They laughed, caught up, and reminisced about that summer they had spent together crossing the United States, two women from vastly different worlds who had formed an unlikely but genuine friendship. But the war had taken its toll on Lyudmila, as it had on millions of others. She suffered from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress syndrome and depression. The memories of those 11 months, the faces she had seen through her scope, the comrades she had lost, the physical and psychological strain of constant combat, all of it weighed on her for the rest of her life. On October 10, 1974, Lyudmila Pavlichenko passed away after suffering a stroke. She was 58 years old. She was buried in Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow, one of the most prestigious burial grounds in Russia, reserved for the nation's most honored citizens. Her son, Rostislav, who survived her by many years, was eventually laid to rest beside her. 2 commemorative Soviet postage stamps were issued in her honor, one in 1943 following her combat service, celebrating her as a hero of the ongoing war, and another in 1976, 2 years after her passing, memorializing her legacy. Today in Russia, Lyudmila Pavlichenko is remembered as a military hero and is universally recognized as the most successful female sniper in history. Her story even inspired art. The American folk singer Woody Guthrie, after meeting her or hearing about her during her 1942 tour, composed a song titled Miss Pavlichenko. The lyrics celebrated her record and her courage, and the song became part of Guthrie's famous Ash recordings. One verse went, "Miss Pavlichenko's well known to fame, Russia's your country. Fighting is your game. The whole world will always love you for all time to come. 300 enemies fell by your gun." In 2015, A joint Ukrainian-Russian film titled Battle for Sevastopol told her story, bringing her experiences to a new generation. The first English-language edition of her memoirs, titled Lady Death, was published by Greenhill Books in February 2018. Her story has inspired several historical fiction novels, and she continues to be studied in military academies around the world as an example of tactical innovation and psychological warfare. But beyond the statistics, beyond the medals and the memorials, what was Lyudmila Pavlichenko's true legacy? What did that crazy trick, that patience game, really represent? In a war defined by massive armies, heavy artillery, tank battles, and strategic bombing, Lyudmila represented something different. She proved that individual skill, tactical innovation, and psychological insight could have strategic impact. She demonstrated that patience could be more powerful than aggression, that one perfect shot could be more valuable than 100 rushed attempts, and that warfare was as much about psychology as it was about firepower. She also challenged fundamental assumptions about gender and combat. The Soviet Union, for all its propaganda about equality, was still a deeply patriarchal society. The military establishment initially didn't want to accept female combat soldiers, but Lyudmila forced them to recognize that capability and courage had nothing to do with gender. The 2,000 female snipers who served in the Red Army, the 500 who survived, all owed something to Lyudmila's example. She had kicked open a door and proven beyond any doubt that women could excel in the most demanding combat roles. Her patience game technique also represented a philosophical shift in how warfare was understood. Traditional military doctrine emphasized speed, aggression, and overwhelming force. Lyudmila showed that sometimes the opposite approach, patience, restraint, and precision, could be more effective. This wasn't just applicable to snipers. Her methodology influenced broader military thinking about special operations, reconnaissance, and asymmetric warfare. Modern special forces around the world employ tactics that trace their intellectual lineage back to innovations like Lyudmila's patience game. There's also something profound about her psychological approach to combat. She understood that the primary weapon wasn't the rifle, it was fear. By making herself invisible, by taking single perfect shots and then vanishing, by waiting days if necessary to achieve maximum psychological impact, she created an aura of invincibility that affected entire enemy units. German soldiers knew her name, they knew her reputation, and that knowledge alone changed how they behaved. They moved more cautiously, advanced more slowly, made more mistakes. This is the essence of psychological warfare, shaping enemy behavior not through direct force, but through manipulation of their emotional and mental state. It's worth noting that Lyudmila's story also reveals the brutal reality of the Eastern Front. The fact that the average lifespan of a Soviet sniper was 3 weeks tells you everything you need to know about the intensity and lethality of that theater of war. The Germans were not incompetent opponents. They had excellent training, superior equipment in many cases, and highly effective tactics. The fact that Lyudmila not only survived but thrived in that environment for 11 months is a testament to her skill that cannot be overstated. Her 11 months of combat also represented an incredible physical and mental endurance test. Imagine lying motionless in freezing or scorching conditions for 15 to 20 hours, sometimes longer, barely eating or drinking, constantly alert for the slightest sign of enemy movement. Then, after waiting for what might be an entire day, having to take a single shot that must be perfect, knowing that any error could mean your immediate demise or the demise of your comrades, and then doing this day after day after day for 11 months. The psychological strain alone would break most people. The training she received and then refined also represented one of the Soviet Union's most effective military innovations. Soviet sniper training was extraordinarily sophisticated emphasizing not just marksmanship, but camouflage, terrain psychology, patience conditioning, and psychological resilience. Trainees learn to observe how wind affected grass, how frost refracted sunlight on metal, how a heartbeat could alter aim at 600 meters. They were trained in pairs, one shooter and one spotter, a system that multiplied efficiency and would later influence NATO doctrine. Some trainees were isolated for weeks in silence, conditioned to lower their pulse, slow their breathing, and resist distraction for hours. This level of systematized training was years ahead of comparable Allied programs. The manuals that eventually incorporated Lyudmila's techniques were classified as top secret and restricted to officer schools. They contained not just firing tables, but detailed case studies, diagrams showing optimal positions relative to sun angle and wind direction, instructions on how to fake footprints, how to construct false positions, how to use reflections to mislead enemy snipers. This was battlefield deception raised to an art form. But perhaps the most human aspect of Lyudmila's story is what happened after the glory faded. She lived with PTSD and depression for 30 years after the war ended. The woman who had been celebrated as Lady Death, who had been received by presidents and given medals by governments, spent her later years in a small Moscow apartment, haunted by memories of what she had seen and done. This is the cost of war that doesn't appear in official records or propaganda films. Lyudmila paid for her service not just with physical wounds, but with psychological scars that never fully healed. Her friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt is also revealing. Two women from completely different political systems, different cultures, different backgrounds, found common ground based on mutual respect and shared experience. Eleanor saw in Lyudmila something authentic, a person who had faced extraordinary circumstances with courage and integrity. Lyudmila saw in Eleanor someone who treated her as a human being rather than as a propaganda tool or a curiosity. That they maintained that friendship across the Cold War divide, despite government supervision and political tensions, speaks to the power of genuine human connection. Today, Lyudmila Pavlichenko's legacy continues to resonate in multiple ways. Military historians study her tactics and methodology as examples of tactical innovation. Gender studies scholars examine her as a figure who challenged and ultimately helped redefine gender roles in military service. Psychologists analyze her ability to enter dissociative states and maintain extreme focus under life-threatening stress. And popular culture continues to tell and retell her story, recognizing that her life represents something compelling and important. The 309 confirmed eliminations, achieved in just 11 months, remain one of the most extraordinary combat records in military history. But more than the numbers, more than the medals, more than the fame, Lyudmila Pavlichenko's true legacy is demonstrating that innovation, discipline, and psychological insight can triumph over superior numbers and firepower. Her patience game, that crazy trick of waiting motionless for hours or days to achieve a single perfect shot, revolutionized Soviet sniper doctrine and influenced military tactics that are still used today. She entered the war as a 25-year-old history student with a rifle and an idea. She emerged as one of the most effective combat soldiers of the entire Second World War, regardless of nationality or gender. She proved that courage and capability have nothing to do with conventional expectations or stereotypes. And she did it all while surviving an environment so dangerous that most of her peers didn't last a month. In the vast sweep of World War II history, with its millions of casualties, massive battles, and world-changing consequences, individual stories can sometimes get lost. But Lyudmila Pavlichenko's story demands to be remembered. It's a story of innovation under pressure, of psychological warfare, of gender barriers broken, and of the incredible things human beings are capable of when circumstances demand it. From a shooting club in Kiev to the battlefields of Odessa and Sevastopol, From the White House to a quiet retirement as a historian, Lyudmila lived a life that was extraordinary by any measure. The patience game, that revolutionary technique of extreme patience, psychological manipulation, and perfect precision, was more than just a tactical innovation. It was a philosophy of combat that recognized that warfare is ultimately about human psychology, fear, courage, decision-making, and the will to continue fighting. By mastering these psychological dimensions, by making herself an invisible and therefore invincible presence, Lyudmila achieved what superior firepower and numbers often cannot. She broke the enemy's will to fight. So when we talk about how one female sniper's crazy trick eliminated 309 enemy combatants in just 11 months, we're really talking about something much larger. We're talking about how innovation can triumph over convention, how patience can be more powerful than aggression, how psychological warfare can be more effective than brute force, and how one person with extraordinary skill and determination can have strategic impact even in the largest conflict in human history. Lyudmila Pavlichenko didn't just fight in World War II. She changed how modern warfare understands the role of snipers, the importance of psychological operations, and the possibilities of what individual soldiers can achieve. Her legacy continues to influence military doctrine, inspire new generations, and remind us that in war, as in life, sometimes the most effective strategy is not the most obvious one. Sometimes the key to victory is simply having the patience to wait for the perfect moment, and when that moment comes, the skill and courage to take it. That was Lyudmila's gift. That was her crazy trick. And that's why her story, more than 80 years after those 11 months of combat, still resonates and still matters. In the summer of 1941, the Eastern Front of Europe was ablaze with one of the most brutal conflicts in human history. The German Wehrmacht had just launched Operation Barbarossa, and millions of Soviet citizens found themselves facing an existential threat unlike anything the world had ever seen. Among the thousands who rushed to recruiting offices across the Soviet Union was a 25-year-old university student from Kiev.